way to Richmond, we will be witnessing the opening of the General Assembly and hopefully to watch Virginia be the 38th state to ratify.
Today is the opening day of the most historic General Assembly in 400 years, and we are going to see the Equal Rights Amendment ratified in Virginia. We'll be the 38th state and finally on the right side of history. So Equal Rights Amendment is 24 simple words. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And all it does is just set human rights for men and women straight into the Constitution.
Once Virginia votes yes, the entire country gets equal rights. It means all of these things that are our inalienable right as human beings will now be recognized by the United States government with the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. And that's why we're here today. And we will be here every single day until they vote yes.
What do we want?
ERA!
When do we want it?
Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. We were founded in 1913 at Howard University in Washington, D.C. We were one of the few African American participants in the Women's Suffrage March. They made us march in the back because they were trying to appease white Southerners. They didn't really want a black presence in the march, but we knew our day was coming.
We decided that we were going to be a part of helping to ratify Virginia to become the 38th state to ratify the ERA.
107 years later, we're hoping that we're helping to bring it full circle here.
I think in America we tend to think of voting as a universal right, but it's important to remind ourselves that voting has long been contested in our nation. Initially, only white property-holding men were allowed to vote.
Without the opportunity to vote, your voice is silenced. The 19th Amendment is the amendment to the Constitution that gave universal suffrage to women, to a point.
Virginia never ratified the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. There have been a temptation, I think, for people to say, well, did the women's suffrage move, at least in Virginia, did it matter? Did it make a difference? The suffrage movement, even though it didn't succeed on the ground here in Virginia, it did prepare a generation of women to feel that they could move forward and affect change.
We must celebrate these women and the work that they did in the 19-teens and their successors into the 1920s.
I don't think we can give enough credit to the women who 100 years ago marched, picketed, persuaded, cajoled, cornered legislators in their offices and even went to their homes to talk to them about women's suffrage. These were women who had a goal in mind. They understood what it was going to be able to do for them. They persevered. They went through an awful lot, and I think we owe them a huge debt of gratitude for what they did.
Virginia, at the turn of the 20th century, was a rapidly changing place. It had recovered from the challenges and the economic downturn following the American Civil War. But as is typical with those kinds of changes, progress also brought some negative side effects as well.
The lower classes, whether they were white or black or people of color, are dealing with horrible working conditions.
They'd only have a few choices, either to work in someone's home as a domestic servant, to work in a factory, very limited, in jobs that didn't require a higher education or a lot of formal education.
There is a massive disparity between the upper end of the economic spectrum and the lower end of the economic spectrum. They're dealing with child labor. There's a really low bottom, and the high is very high. Without the restrictions of an 8-hour workday, you could easily be working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The toll that takes on your body is significant, and then to think that these women who are doing that type of work are then expected to turn around and also create a healthy home environment. You don't physically have the capacity to do it all. And you start to see women responding, women of the upper class starting to organize to help better their communities. They saw it as basically an extension of the home. If they were responsible for children in their own home, shouldn't they be responsible for the children of the community? And so you start to see education associations form. Many of the Richmond women's clubs are established in the 1890s. And so it sees groups of women that are gathering together to better themselves intellectually and then turn that into social good.
And what they discovered was that while they might be listened to politely, they had limited ability to affect change because they couldn't choose the people who made the laws.
This is the environment that we are working in. And how do you change that environment? You get the opportunity to vote. You get the opportunity to push your needs out there. Put in the people who are going to be speaking up for you in those places.
And so in 1909, a group of women met in Richmond and agreed to form the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia, whose sole purpose was to secure the right to vote for Virginia women. The Equal Suffrage League was formed in the parlor of a woman named Anne Crenshaw, and they chose as their first president a very prominent Richmond woman who had been very active, particularly in education and public health reform efforts in Richmond, a woman named Lila Meade Valentine.
Lila Meade Valentine is born just at the very end of the Civil War in 1865. She marries Benjamin Valentine, and they travel together. They go over to England, and it's there where she first encounters the suffrage movement in the 1890s. They were a lot more radical, so much so that they were characterized here in America as being anti-government. And yet, there's still, I think what Lila Meade takes away is this idea of women gathering together to affect change for themselves. Maybe not just for children, maybe not just for the community, but that women could help women.
Lila Meade Valentine, she was the first president, and she was a very active leader of the organization. She traveled around the state, traveled across the country, giving speeches about suffrage. She was really a tireless advocate for women to have the right to vote.
It was so bold. This idea that these women would come together and figure out a plan for how women could get the right to vote in Virginia, the heart of the Deep South, the capital of the Confederacy here in Richmond, and they're coming together and advocating for their own right to the franchise not more than 7 years after the 1902 Constitution that has just solidified Jim Crow across the state.
The 1901-1902 changes to the Virginia Constitution restricted the black vote by design. What you saw in Reconstruction was that you had so many Black men who were elected to office on all different levels, from local, state, and even to national. But the backlash to that was to find ways to systematically make it so that they would not be able to be leaders within the elected community. And it wasn't just blacks that were kept out. It was poor whites as well. It was American Indians who weren't considered to be citizens.
The impact of the 1902 State Convention was that it effectively disenfranchised about 90% of the black men that were able to vote, and interestingly, it also disenfranchised about 50% of white male voters.
So it made Virginia a government that was run primarily by its more elite and more privileged white men.
The Equal Suffrage League, they were very careful in their message to say that they were going to be asking the men of Virginia for their rights, and that the men of Virginia would give it to them when politely asked, unlike, let's say, the suffragettes in England who were fighting for it.
The Equal Suffrage League, they were affiliated with the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NAWSA. NAWSA was interested in working state by state, which sounds tedious, and it was, because that meant that you had to persuade legislators in each of the states. And that could take a long time, particularly in the South and in Virginia.
The Equal Suffrage League's first priority was to educate people on why it was important for women to vote and why it was wrong to deny women what was considered the most essential and basic right of citizenship. Education sounds easy, but it was not, because first, women had to gain the ability to reach people, and they used a wide variety of tactics.
They had their tea parties, their coffees, their lectures, sort of all couched within this realm of what women's clubs were already doing. Then they branched out a little bit further into having public lectures and public meetings that people could attend. Still very well within the realm of what women were already doing publicly and civically speaking. Next, they start really aggressive letter writing campaigns, connecting themselves with suffragists around the country and around the state, organizing the ladies in Norfolk, the groups in Lynchburg, making sure that everybody was on message.
Well, what we have here is a variety of material from the Equal Suffrage League papers. So it's programs and newspapers and a gazillion leaflets, letterhead, all kinds of things. This is how they communicated, because this is a period where you don't have social media and you don't have email, so and not everybody had a phone, so you couldn't just pick up the phone and call someone. So using the mail, which was delivered a couple times a day in urban areas, using postcards because they were cheap, and it was just a way of getting the material out there.
And then they move into even the more public realm of having talks on the street corner, having really large public rallies. Again, these are things that I think we're very comfortable with today, that were seen as huge steps of women into the public sphere at that time.
Women speaking out in public, giving public lectures, leading demonstrations, was a somewhat radical sight in early 20th century Virginia, because historically and traditionally, it was believed that women should be relegated to the domestic sphere. They should not concern themselves, they should not be involved in civic life, including politics.
So from 1909 to 1912, the pro-suffrage movement really kind of dominates here in Richmond. They're organizing across the state. But by the General Assembly session of 1912, the antis begin to organize.
And in 1912, they form the Virginia Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. They made various arguments against extending the ballot to all American women, and many anti-suffrage forces use those traditional conceptions of femininity to argue against extending the right to vote to women.
This talk about the emancipation of woman is mere twaddle. If you wish to unsex her, humiliate her, cast her a helpless toy into the seething vortex of political chicanery, rivalry, and whatnot, give her the ballot.
They believed that if women had the right to vote, somehow it would change women. It would make them more masculine. They believed that politics was a rough and tumble business and it was better suited to men.
Woman has her special work in the world, and to do it well, she cannot do a man's work, any more than a man can assume her work and responsibilities.
The first president of the Virginia Association opposed to women's suffrage is Mrs. Jane Rutherford, and you just get the sense that she's the society madam. She's old, they're all doing things the same way that their parents did before the war. But there's this group of really active ladies underneath her who utilize some of the same tactics that Lila Mead, Valentine, and the equal suffrage ladies were, so much so that they start to bring in public lecturers and have these public movements, and that's when Lila Mead is able to hit them in the newspapers with this argument of welcome to the public forum.
By holding a public political meeting at which the speakers were women, the anti-suffragists registered the approval of women as speakers on a political platform, and we shall therefore hear no more of the unwomanliness of appearing on such public occasions.
You then see a lot of letters to the editor. They're making news by some of their public events, but it's these letters to the editor chastising the anti-suffragists, responses from the anti-suffragists to the suffragists.
I am a suffragist because I believe in people. Not half of the people or any particular portion of the people, but all of the people.
What has the agitation of the question done for Virginia? It has introduced politics, party spirit, jealousy, and uncharitableness where none before existed.
I think that all one needs to be converted to the cause is to hear an anti-suffragist argue.
The ballot given to women will be the entering wedge of untold evils, a social cataclysm.
So it was really in the public sphere. You couldn't ignore it if you were reading the newspaper. You probably couldn't ignore it if you were checking your mail. And you certainly couldn't ignore it if you were attending social events. It was on every lady's mind.
The Equal Suffrage League was ultimately very successful. There were very few areas of the state that did not have a local chapter of the Suffrage League reporting back to the central headquarters periodically on their activities. And the Equal Suffrage League became the largest suffrage organization anywhere in the country and the largest private organization in Virginia.
Like 140 some odd chapters from the Eastern Shore all the way to Big Stone Gap and north into Winchester and all the way down into Southside. They're very active. The women like Lila Mead Valentine, these are women who are willing to go anywhere, anytime practically, and talk about suffrage. They travel all over the state.
The Equal Suffrage League of Virginia, like so many suffrage associations across the nation, was a whites-only organization from its founding in 1909.
They weren't advocating for blacks to join in the organization because the separation of the races was so strong. You know, racism was so strong. It was such a pervasive part of society at that time.
The unfortunate thing is, for understanding the role of African American women in supporting women's suffrage, we just don't have the records, or we haven't been able to find those records.
The records for them were not preserved as well as records for the white women who were part of the movement.
We know that they were active through their women's clubs and their other organizations. They discussed suffrage, they supported it, they wanted it, but where those records are, we don't really know. We do know that Maggie Walker and other African American women in Virginia advocated women's suffrage.
Maggie L. Walker was born in Richmond, Virginia in 1864, and she lived until 1934. And with that, she was such a strong advocate for opening opportunities and providing ways to get equal rights for women like herself. And that is what I believe really drove Mrs. Walker to work so hard to work with organizations that will be working to get the right to vote for women. But the national women's suffrage organizations didn't openly invite Black women to be a part of it.
The Southern states were not going to support suffrage if African American women were out there publicly advocating women's suffrage. Because particularly in the South, where you had Jim Crow, and where you have distinct communities, and there is a very obvious suppression of the African American vote.
Many men feared giving women the right to vote would empower enough Black women to vote that it would jeopardize white supremacy in the state, the white control of Virginia's government.
In 1915, the Virginia Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage puts out a pamphlet that gets reprinted in the paper, talking about Virginia warns her people against suffrage.
It is a hard fact that 29 counties of Virginia would be condemned by women's suffrage to colored rule. Surely we are not to be incited to return to the slime pit from which we dug ourselves.
If women get the right to vote, once again, you may have Black rule, because there are more Black women that would be eligible to vote.
It was really the coup de grace, that if African Americans could vote, that Virginia was going to not have white supremacy anymore.
As Lila Mead Valentine would point out, there were voting restrictions still in place. Poll taxes, literacy tests, also extra-legal ways to scare someone from coming to the polls. So the threat of having Black rule once again, there were things in place to keep that from happening.
The same restrictions which now apply to men must also apply to women. And as these qualifications restrict the Negro man's vote, it stands to reason that they will also restrict the Negro woman's vote.
So she was making a very carefully calculated decision not to advocate for Black female suffrage because she knew that would force the suffrage movement in general to lose a lot of potential support.
I don't think it was their initial strategy, but they wanted that state amendment passed, and they were out there promoting white supremacy as a reason for women getting the vote.
Well, despite the growth of the Equal Suffrage League and the success they had in getting a member of the legislature to at least introduce an amendment to the state constitution, it was rarely taken seriously.
A measure to give Virginia women the right to vote was introduced in the General Assembly 3 times between the years of 1912 and 1916.
And when it did come to the floor for a vote, it was overwhelmingly defeated. At the national level, a woman named Alice Paul, who had been very active in the National Woman Suffrage Association, was recognizing that the state-by-state approach that many of the state leagues were taking was simply not going to get across the finish line quickly enough.
Alice Paul, who had spent some time in London witnessing the activities of British suffragists, saw more militant tactics, more attention-grabbing tactics being used to fight for women's suffrage in England, and she brought some of that sensibility back to the U.S. It was Alice Paul that staged the large suffrage parade in Washington, D.C.
In 1913, you see a group of Virginia women head up for a major rally in Washington, D.C.
Thousands and thousands of women from all across the country turned out and marched state by state. It was an exciting, exhilarating, amazing time that most women never had experienced before.
This parade is racially segregated, so there is that underlying tension that happens there with African American women also joining the parade.
They were relegated to the rear, in part because there were some Southern women that didn't want to march alongside African American women. So they did march, but they were toward the rear of the parade.
In 1913, Alice Paul broke from the National Suffrage Association and formed the Congressional Union. Alice Paul wanted to pursue a federal amendment, a change to the Constitution to give women the right to vote.
The Congressional Union wanted to put a lot of pressure on Congress to pass a federal amendment. The best way to do this was to be confrontational, not violent, but to picket the White House, to have parades in the middle of downtown Washington, D.C.
The Equal Suffrage League of Virginia was focused very much on getting a constitutional change to Virginia's Constitution and having the state grant women the right to vote. But after the first year or so of that campaign, there were a number of members in the league who realized this was really an uphill battle.
And by 1913, 1914, the group has grown sufficiently large that there's dissent among the ranks. And there is a woman here in Richmond, Sophie Meredith. She wants to see results. She wants to see more action. So Sophie Meredith, she's a member of the Women's Club initially, and really becomes a pretty key member of Lila Mead Valentine's circle. She is spicy and fiery and known for having her own opinions. She's just this grand dame in Richmond society.
She believed that the time and effort that was being spent on trying to achieve a state amendment to the Virginia Constitution was simply not going to pay off.
And so she partners with the Congressional Union at the national level.
And within short order, there were state chapters of the Congressional Union formed. And by 1916, there was one, a strong one, up and running in Virginia. And its focus was ratifying at the federal level.
It might have just been the ladies getting fed up. I mean, you have the Virginia politicians saying no time and time again, and at some point you have to say, okay, if I'm not gonna get it from you, I gotta go to the next chain up the ladder. And they saw the federal amendment as the cure-all to getting women the right to vote, and they really didn't want to have tea parties and do things the Virginia way. They wanted to get action, and they wanted the federal amendment passed, and they knew that their sole focus really needed to be at the Capitol in DC and not here in Richmond.
That group, I think, gets a lot of the attention because they are very public and they're out there.
They hired the services of a nationally famous female pilot to do a flyover of the state fair. And this was Catherine Stinson, who is described as the girl aviator wonder. So if you were an attendee of Virginia State Fair that year, you would have heard this roaring plane buzzing over the Midway. As you were looking up at the plane at this famous young female aviator buzzing overhead, you would have been rained upon by leaflets promoting the cause of female suffrage. And again, this particular action was one of the many actions that the Congressional Union staged to draw attention to their cause.
So you have two groups. They are somewhat competing. Their ultimate goal is women's suffrage. They're differing in their tactics. The State League, like the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia, is focusing on an amendment to the state constitution. The Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage is focusing on a federal amendment to the federal constitution.
The tenor of these two groups was also quite different. The ESL focused on the feminine respectability of its members. It did not want to rock the boat.
They were not confrontational. They did not intend to be confrontational. It was all about education and quiet persuasion.
Whereas the Congressional Union believed in taking that more radical approach, and they were less concerned with preserving a notion of Southern feminine gentility like their counterparts in the ESL were.
So that put the Congressional Union at odds with the Equal Suffrage League and divided suffragists on that question. And it created some tensions within Virginia.
Lila Mead Valentine thought that it was a huge tactical error to split the movement between the Equal Suffrage League and the Congressional Union. She thought they should present a unified force as Virginia women to get a state amendment passed to the Virginia Constitution. And Lila Mead Valentine goes after the women of the Congressional Union, including her friend Sophie Meredith, in the newspapers.
The Equal Suffrage League of Virginia condemns the folly of the fanatical women who are picketing the White House.
And they rewrite the bylaws of the Equal Suffrage League so that you cannot have executive membership in both of these organizations. You had to choose your path. You could either be Congressional Union or you could be Equal Suffrage League, but you couldn't be both. The rift was never fully healed. You see the Equal Suffrage League start to utilize the tactics of Congressional Union women because they were working. They draw them into these more public gatherings, street corner chats. They line up schedules about who's going to be on what street corner in Richmond.
Adele Clark was very young, probably the youngest woman who participated in the founding of the Equal Suffrage League. She was an artist.
She used to set up her easel on street corners in Richmond and start to paint with the explicit intent of drawing curious onlookers to come over and see what she was doing.
When people would walk up to her, she'd engage them in conversation and then slowly work in women and the right to vote.
She said there came a point where she couldn't see a fire hydrant in the street without launching into, "Ladies and gentlemen," her suffrage spiel.
The reaction to the crowds that they spoke with, or even to individuals they spoke with, was mixed. Often they were listened to very politely. There are reports of one suffragist who said she was actually spat upon, and Lila Mead Valentine had pepper thrown in her face. So it wasn't always a positive reaction. Equal Suffrage League members were figuring out that you had to track the thoughts and the opinions of the men who would be making the decision. So they actually opened what today would be like an information file. They did them on index cards. They opened a card for every member of the Virginia General Assembly, and then they would record what their comments were, what their position was on suffrage.
Would fain shield the weaker and fairer sex from embarrassments, hardships, and contamination of political strife.
Frankly opposed for fear of losing votes in November.
Personally, I am not opposed to votes for women. However, I cannot vote on the federal amendment.
Thinks constituents against it, and that Southern states should not be burdened by additional Negro electorate.
It was something very commonplace in lobbying today, but at the time that really wasn't done. And it was a real innovation that I think showed how serious the Suffrage League was and how inventive they could be.
Here are historic pictures of events that resulted in a constitutional amendment. It's 1917, and the 69-year drive by women for the right to vote is climaxed by this appeal at the White House.
In January 1917, the Congressional Union started the protest action of picketing the White House. Members of the CU, the Congressional Union, would stand outside the gates of the White House. Every single day they would stand there, they would hold banners. They didn't say anything, they didn't preach or give speeches. They became known as the Silent Sentinels. They weren't entirely silent, though, because often their banners carried questions for the president. Mr. President, how long will you deny women the right to vote? Mr. President, what are you doing to advance democracy for women? And so forth. And these silent sentinels, they not only endured awful weather conditions, but they endured a lot of abuse at the hands of the public and also at the hands of police, who started to arrest them and send them to jail.
The women who were members of the Equal Suffrage League chapter in Norfolk, the ones who break in 1915 and join the Congressional Union, are really active, and they're picketing, they get arrested. Nell Mercer has, we think, the record for the number of arrests by a Virginia suffragist. I think it's something like 7 or 8. These are women who, they're very active and very vocal. Pauline Adams, who was from Norfolk, had been a founding member of the Norfolk chapter of the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia. But by 1915, she realized that the Congressional Union probably had a better shot.
We do not feel that Southern women should be called on to plead personally with every male voter in the state. This seems to us a useless indignity to place on Southern women.
And she was of Irish descent, a fiery Irish woman, one of my favorite suffragists, because you knew exactly where you stood with her. And she was very comfortable being more militant about insisting on suffrage. So she joined the picket lines outside the White House, and she was arrested simply for standing there holding a banner demanding the right to vote.
Many of the Silent Sentinels were jailed in the Occoquan Workhouse in Lorton, Virginia, where they were subjected to just horrific conditions, dirty cells, dirty water, just horrific conditions.
When she was released eventually, the stories that she told and those of other women who were incarcerated there, I think really helped turn the tide of public opinion, because the women who were imprisoned, like Adams, were force-fed when they refused to eat, suffered a number of indignities. It was not treatment that America was used to meting out to women, and it seemed highly unjust. And more Americans, I think, looked at that and said, are we really willing to go to these lengths to deny women the right to vote?
And finally, they got sort of fed up with Wilson because he refused to support women's suffrage. They started burning his speeches in Lafayette Park, which is across from the White House. And that was because he was talking about democracy overseas, the United States. He wanted to take the states into World War I. And the women in this country were saying, excuse me, democracy starts at home. And it was all a pressure campaign.
By 1919, after many unsuccessful attempts to get a state amendment passed, the Equal Suffrage League recognized that the momentum at the national level was growing much faster, and they did throw their support behind working to ratify the 19th Amendment to the Constitution.
But after years and decades of agitating by female suffragists, President Wilson, who initially opposed female suffrage when he was elected to the presidency in 1916, he changed his mind.
It's all about pressure. And if you embarrass the president enough, and it happened, he eventually came out and he said, basically, I need these ladies off my back. I will support women's suffrage.
In the late teens, Congress again takes up the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, and first the House passed it, and then the Senate passed it as well. And then that amendment got sent out to the states. At this time, there were 48 states in the nation, and to get that 3/4 threshold required to ratify an amendment, 36 states needed to approve.
The General Assembly that meets in Richmond in 1920 does not vote to ratify the 19th Amendment.
In August of 1920, 35 of the 36 states needed for ratification had passed, so one more state was needed. Of the remaining states, almost all of them were likely to vote no against the suffrage amendment.
And yet, in August of 1920, on the 18th, Tennessee ratifies the 19th Amendment, and a week later, on August 26th, the Anthony Amendment is engrossed into the U.S. Constitution. All women around the country technically have the right to vote on that day. It was a magnificent moment.
The long fight was officially over. The suffrage movement, in the words of leader Carrie Chapman Catt, was a long story of hard work and heartaches, but it was crowned by victory.
Even though Virginia landed in the no column in voting for the 19th Amendment, all Virginia women, as well as all American women, were guaranteed the right to vote.
Ultimately, the Congressional Union's position favoring fighting for the National Amendment, ultimately that was successful. Virginia women gained the right to vote because of the ratification of the 19th Amendment rather than because of a change in the state constitution. Nonetheless, I think the work that the Equal Suffrage League did in Virginia, canvassing, campaigning, raising the issue of women's rights to vote and advancing the arguments for it, helped that. It helped to convince Virginia's U.S. senators and representatives that suffrage, in effect, for women was inevitable and they should support it.
They take a breath, they're excited, and then they get right down to work registering women to vote.
Keep in mind, the final state that pushed ratification over did so in August of 1920. There wasn't a whole lot of time for women to register to vote, and there were barriers to women's registration. Adele Clark organized out of the Equal Suffrage League the League of Women Voters.
They go out and have voter drives, they do postcard mailings, they're utilizing the same tactics to get women registered that they had been doing, trying to get women to vote. And they're really successful.
Women across Virginia, white and black, often rush the polls to register to vote. Of course, for many women who were poorer and black women, they faced the restrictions that were already in place for men.
Obstacles such as poll taxes, where in order to vote, you had to pay the poll tax for the year before. There were literacy tests that you would have to go before a registrar and read a certain passage or answer these particular questions.
The registrar could ask you any question he wanted to. How many grains of sand in the beach? Where is the Nile River? This is the state constitution. Can you interpret this particular clause? There were no set questions. It was totally up to the registrar.
In addition, African American women who tried to register to vote found there were very few registrars in their neighborhoods, and they had to travel in order to find one where they could stand in line and submit their paperwork. In Richmond, Maggie Walker and Ora Brown Stokes, two African American community leaders who were strong supporters of women's suffrage, they worked very hard to make it as feasible as possible for African American women to vote.
They're at the registrar's office, noticing how many white women are there and how many black women are there and how few registrars there are to work for to get the black women registered to vote. Mrs. Walker says, "Make me a registrar." I'll help get this going through.
When there are long lines, you see the white registrar coming down and actually closing registration, closing hours early, so that there aren't as many African American women registering to vote. And then they get really smart about it. Ora Stokes situates herself in the basement of Town Hall, and there's a telephone there. And she would call to a telephone in Jackson Ward, where a small group of women would come over to the basement of Town Hall. So these small groups of women from Jackson Ward will come over, register to vote. Another small group is called over, another small group is called over, so that there's never a long line of African American women in the basement of Town Hall attracting the attention of the registrar.
The election of November 1920 was the first time that women newly empowered with the right to vote through the 19th Amendment actually exercised that right, went out to the ballot boxes. And in Virginia, many women very excitedly embraced that right. From 1916 to 1920, Virginia's votership went up by more than 52%, which represented about 79,000 new voters going to the polls.
And I think it took some people by surprise. The prevailing thought was that women really were not interested in voting. I think it's kind of a surprise to people, the number of women who show up to register, that clearly they want to vote.
Lila Meade Valentine in 1920 is bedridden. She is excited that women now have the right to vote around Virginia, but she is not able to leave her home to vote, and she passes away in 1921 without ever having utilized the franchise that she fought so hard for.
With women gaining the ballot, politicians in both parties, I think, quickly realized that this represented a large new class of voters, and politicians had to be responsive to that. So pretty quickly after 1920, and also largely through the efforts of the League of Women Voters, which was the successor to the Equal Suffrage League, you see candidates starting to visit towns to give campaign speeches, to fill out questionnaires that were circulated by the League of Women Voters, declaring what their positions were on various issues. So pretty quickly, they recognized that the female voter was a new force to be dealt with in Virginia politics.
Between 1920 and into the later years of the 1930s, amazing changes took place in terms of legislation that benefited women, benefited workers, benefited healthcare, improved public education, things that women had been striving for a long time.
There was still voter suppression against women in general. Again, that understanding clause, the literacy test, the poll tax could be applied very differently based on how the local registrar felt about women being able to vote. But African American women suffered much more greatly than white Virginians and white women. And it's not really until the 1960s and early 1970s that you start to see that pattern actually change.
The 19th Amendment to the Constitution says that the right of a citizen to vote should not be denied or abridged, based on sex. Where the issues come in is in the definition of who is a citizen and who is not. Even though it is defined in the amendments prior to the Constitution that a natural-born person to the United States would be a citizen, it didn't keep states from finding ways around that definition. It took the Voting Rights Act and the 24th Amendment to the Constitution to get rid of poll taxes so that people could vote. And we're not even talking about how it was for Asian Americans and American Indians who had to establish themselves even to be citizens in the first place.
The Voting Rights Act in 1965 really changed the world, especially for the South, because we got our right to the ballot. So 100 years ago is important, but just as well as 60 years ago is just as important. Today, we are reenacting the historic photo of when women got together to celebrate or to really push for women's suffrage, for the right to vote. And we're gathering with other agents of change all over the Commonwealth to show our progress in the last 100 years.
Some of the suffragists thought that if they just got the vote, that would give them the equality. And as we know, 100 years later, it doesn't mean that you're suddenly equal.
For our country to be more equitable, we really have to acknowledge our history and how we haven't been equitable in the past. That's really important because people aren't going to buy into a new system if they feel like the new system is going to be exactly like the old system. So I'm here, and the women that are around me are here to show that we're the dawn of a new age, and that the right to vote is a small but important step to freedom and equity.
The original photo taken 100 years ago of the Equal Suffrage League members on Capitol Square is iconic because of who's in it. You've got women such as Lila Mead Valentine and Dedell Clark, and a wide variety of other prominent women from Richmond who were determined to make this amendment the law of the land.
What's really different 100 years later that there are women of color, that there are trans women, that there are people that identify across the spectrum of gender. So the photo of this year shows the progress, it shows the faces of the forgotten.
I think that whether they knew it or not, the women weren't just fighting for the rights of women, they were fighting for people who are oppressed. They set me up just by being women who went against the grain and went against the current and allowed me to be as outspoken as I am by setting an example and a precedent.
Well, we look at this and we think 100 years, oh my gosh, it's not that long ago.
If the women from the 1915 suffragist photograph picked up today's photograph, I think they would feel a certain sense of pride in their activities and their activism in changing the role of women, in changing attitudes about women being involved in civic life is now bearing fruit about 100 years later. Even though the Equal Suffrage League may have failed in getting the General Assembly to pass the 19th Amendment in 1920, they nevertheless had a huge and lasting impact on Virginia politics.
It showed them that developing new tactics and more sophisticated lobbying methods would stand them in good stead, and it got them accustomed to working within the political process so that when suffrage did come, women were prepared now to go and lobby legislators for the reforms that they so desperately wanted to see.
And so for those reasons, I think it's really critical to look back to this history and understand this history. It helps us also understand the larger trajectory of fighting for voting rights in this country.
The right to vote is a hard-won right. And it's taken many generations to get us to where we are today. So we each need to appreciate that right.
It's important to be vigilant, not take anything for granted, but continue to work for change and progress.